It started innocently enough. Emma loved antiques, dusty shops filled with forgotten relics and the faint smell of aged wood and old paper. One rainy afternoon, she stumbled upon a small store at the edge of town, hidden behind the shadow of a larger building. The windows were foggy, and the sign simply read, "Curiosities." Inside it smelled of cedar, dust, and something faintly metallic. Shelves were lined with toys, dolls, and porcelain figurines from decades past. Most were cracked, chipped, or missing limbs, but one row caught her eye. Old dolls with glassy eyes, perfectly preserved. Their painted smiles were unsettlingly wide, but there was something about them that drew her in. The shopkeeper, an elderly man with a thin, pale face, smiled as she examined them. "They have histories," he said softly, voice trembling. "They watch, some of them more than others." Emma laughed nervously, brushing it off as a sales tactic. She purchased 3 dolls that caught her eye, their eyes reflecting the dim light like tiny, frozen orbs. She brought them home, arranging them carefully on a shelf in her bedroom. That night, as rain tapped against the windows, she felt a strange unease. The dolls seemed to stare at her, not with the lifeless gaze she expected, but with awareness, as though they were studying her in the darkness. "Don't." Emma shook off the feeling. She told herself it was imagination, stress from work, the sound of the storm playing tricks. But then she noticed it. The dolls were never where she left them. A doll that had sat on the shelf now leaned slightly forward. One that had faced the window now faced the bed. She tried to convince herself she had moved them in her sleep, that she was imagining things, but over the next few nights, the changes became more pronounced. Dolls would sit on her dresser, face her directly, hands positioned unnaturally, and sometimes she could swear they had moved closer to the bed. One night, unable to sleep, Emma kept her eyes on the shelf. The room was dark except for the faint glow of the streetlight outside. She blinked and one of the dolls was no longer on the shelf. It sat at the edge of her bed, tiny glass eyes fixed on her, heart racing. She reached for it, but her fingers passed through it, as though it were both there and not. Panic gripped her. She looked around frantically, only to see the other 2 dolls standing at the foot of the bed, their smiles wider than before, unnaturally so. A faint whisper echoed in the room, soft, almost unintelligible, but distinctly a child's voice. "We've been waiting, watching." Emma tried to leave the room, but the door slammed shut. The temperature dropped sharply, her breath forming misty clouds in the air. Shadows from the dolls stretched across the walls, growing taller, writhing unnaturally. She realized with bone-deep horror that these weren't ordinary dolls. They were aware, patient, and malicious. Her mind raced towards its sleep paralysis, hallucinations. But the pain in her arms and the weight she felt when touching the dolls proved it was real. And when she looked at them, she felt it. A gaze that pierced her soul, an ancient hunger encoded in the glassy eyes. Over the next few nights, the terror escalated. Emma's sleep was fragmented by nightmares of tiny hands dragging her into darkness, whispered threats crawling into her mind. Dolls appeared in places she hadn't left them, on her dresser, her chair, even hanging from the ceiling, impossibly balanced, as if the room itself had become their playground. The whispers grew clearer. "Watch, always watch, never sleep." Her reflection in mirrors sometimes showed dozens of doll faces behind her, mouths opening in silent laughter. She tried to get rid of them, stuffing them into boxes, taking them to the trash, but the next morning, they were back on the shelf. Staring at her, desperate, Emma researched online, digging into forums about cursed toys, haunted dolls, and objects that carried consciousness beyond death. She found stories of children disappearing after acquiring old toys, families tormented by objects that seemed alive. Some described dolls that moved independently, whispered secrets, and exerted influence over the household. The parallels were undeniable. These dolls were not mere playthings, they were predators, patient and cunning, feeding on fear and attention. Emma realized she had invited something ancient and malevolent into her home, something that now considered her its property. One night she decided to confront them. Armed with a flashlight and determination, she spoke aloud, "I know you're here. Leave me alone." The response was immediate. Shadows lengthened, wrapping around the dolls as they moved closer, their heads tilting unnaturally, smiles widening impossibly. The whispering escalated to a cacophony of voices, some high-pitched, some guttural, all echoing inside her skull. "Play. Stay forever." Her arms and legs froze as if the room itself had ensnared her. One doll leaped from the shelf with impossible speed, landing on the bed beside her, eyes glowing brighter, hands reaching out. The sense of hunger was overwhelming, crushing her with dread. By dawn, Emma was exhausted, trembling, and pale. The dolls had returned to their original positions, innocent once again, or so it seemed. But she knew the truth. They were always aware, always patient, and their patience was infinite. She tried to sleep during the day, avoided mirrors, and never left the dolls alone. And yet, in the quiet moments, she could feel them watching, calculating, waiting for the moment she faltered. Every movement, every glance, every thought carried the risk of feeding them. The nights only grew worse. Emma couldn't tell when reality ended and the doll's influence began. Even during the day, the shadows of their tiny porcelain hands seemed to reach from shelves and tables, curling toward her with a patience that was unnerving. Mirrors reflected dozens of eyes, glassy, cold, unblinking, and when she dared to look directly, she felt a pressure on her chest, a silent voice burrowing into her mind. Look, stay, play with us forever. One evening, Emma awoke to a faint tapping at her bedroom window. Rain lashed against the glass, but the sound was deliberate, rhythmic, hesitant. She approached and saw a doll perched on the outside ledge, staring directly at her. Its hair was damp, its dress soaked, eyes glimmering faintly in the streetlight. Her breath caught. She had locked every door and window, yet here it was, watching, patient, mocking. Before she could react, it vanished, simply gone. But the feeling remained. They were never confined to one space. They could reach anywhere, and they were always patient. Waiting for the exact moment she let her guard down, Emma tried to destroy them. One by one, she smashed the dolls against the floor, the walls, the bathroom sink. Porcelain shattered, stuffing spilled, glass eyes scattered across the carpet. For a fleeting moment, she thought she had succeeded. The apartment was quiet, the oppressive weight seemed lifted. But by midnight, new dolls appeared identical to the ones she had destroyed, as if the act of violence had only made them stronger. Worse, these new dolls were slightly different, their smiles wider, their eyes darker, their gaze heavier. They didn't just watch anymore, they lingered, following her movements with an intelligence that made her skin crawl. Sleep became impossible. Every attempt to rest ended in the same nightmare. Dolls crawling across the walls, climbing the bedposts, whispering incessantly, tiny fingers tracing her skin. Sometimes, she could feel them pressing against her, cold and rigid, and when she opened her eyes, a doll would be sitting at the edge of the bed, inches from her face, staring silently. The whispers grew louder in her mind. Stay, play, join us. At times, multiple voices overlapped, some childish, some distorted, chanting, mocking, commanding. Her apartment had become a cage, and she had no key. Desperate, Emma researched more, discovering old folklore and warnings. There were stories of toys that could harbor spirits, objects that gained sentience after witnessing death, despair, or fear. Some said dolls collected fragments of the soul from their owners, feeding on attention, emotion, and imagination. Others spoke of cursed objects tied to ancient entities, patient and eternal, waiting for new victims to invite them in. The parallels to her own situation were undeniable. These were not ordinary dolls, they were predators, using innocence as a mask, patience as a weapon, and curiosity as bait. One night, she tried reasoning with them. I know you're here. I won't let you control me, she whispered. Immediately, the temperature dropped sharply. Shadows elongated, stretching unnaturally across the walls. The dolls moved closer, climbing from shelves, sitting on chairs, standing at the foot of the bed, heads tilting in impossible angles. Their eyes glimmered with a malicious light. And for the first time, Emma noticed their mouths moving, whispering words she couldn't understand, a language that pierced her mind like ice. Fear gripped her as she realized reasoning would not work. They didn't negotiate. They waited. They hunted, and she was their prey. Emma tried to leave. She packed a bag, planning to escape to a friend's house. But the apartment seemed to resist. Doors slammed shut, windows rattled violently, and the dolls appeared in every corner, silently observing. Her bag moved across the room on its own, landing near the center of the apartment, surrounded by a new circle of dolls she had never seen before. They were identical in every horrifying way, yet subtly different, smiles wider, eyes sharper, their forms slightly taller, more imposing. The whispers surged into a roar. You belong, stay, play. Panic overwhelmed her. She fell to the floor, covering her face. Trembling, realizing there was no exit, dates merged into nights into an endless cycle of terror. Emma's friends called, texts went unanswered, emails ignored. She couldn't leave, couldn't sleep, couldn't hide. Every reflective surface now harbored watching eyes. Every shadow could contain a hidden doll, and every creak in the floorboards or rustle of fabric was a potential approach. Her sense of time distorted. Minutes felt like hours, hours like days. The doll's patience was infinite. They did not tire. They did not sleep. They waited for the perfect moment to claim her fully, to break the boundary between observer and victim. One night, exhausted, she sank into her bed, eyes wide with terror, staring at the dolls lined along the shelf. For a moment, all was still. Then, with impossible speed, they moved, leaping from shelves, chairs, and dressers. The whispers became a deafening chant, an overwhelming presence pressing into her mind. She tried to fight, to scream, to resist, but her body refused to respond. One doll landed on her chest, tiny hands pressing with unnatural force, eyes glowing bright, mouth opening impossibly wide, releasing a shrill, piercing sound that echoed inside her skull. Everything went black when she awoke. The apartment was silent again. The dolls sat on the shelf, innocent once more. But Emma knew better. Something had entered her, something that would never leave. Her reflection in the mirror, face pale, hollow-eyed expression frozen in fear, was no longer entirely her own. She was tethered to them, connected to their awareness, and she realized the most horrifying truth. They were patient. eternal, watching, and now. So was she, whether she wanted it or not. Locals who passed by the shop whispered of its cursed items, toys that watched, objects that consumed attention and emotion. Some claimed they could hear whispers through closed windows, faint giggles and murmurs at night, always observing. Emma's apartment became a cautionary tale. Never buy old toys, never invite curiosity into a home that isn't yours to control. And most importantly, never underestimate what patience can create, because some things, once invited, never leave, and they never stop watching. Never leave, and they never stop watching.